Sunsetting. It's a word that makes every Destiny player clench their fists, and it's the one word that will make all eyes jump up in fear that they're about to get smacked. A simple concept, with a lot of revisions over the years, and with the most recent announcement of all weapons being set free from level caps, with Bungie actively looking to add all of the sunset weapons back into the pool someday, we should talk about the complicated history of sunsetting, the complicated history of the DCV, and why Destiny's sunset problem might have been their biggest of all time. Strap in with me, please subscribe if you're new or haven't already been subscribed, and ride through time with me on this community journey. This Tuesday and for the next 5 weeks, Twitch drops with special emblems for new ones for watching each week are on at EvanF1997 stream on Twitch. Yes, Bungie is sponsoring me. Again. What? Yeah, I don't know how either, guys. Don't worry, I asked the same question. I will be competing for the first official trophy with the falling guillotine against your favorite creators. This was put together by creators and sponsored by Bungie to check out the Pantheon. And they want to do more fun stuff like this in the future. So please tune in, guys. It would mean a lot, even if I know a lot of you guys don't use Twitch. Okay, thank you for listening. This was not sponsored. I just wanted to shout it out because it was really cool. Now we go back to the video. Some footage in this video is from players around the community. Their links will be in the description of this video, as well as music too. Most would agree with me when I say that the Destiny 2 experience has not always been smooth sailing. However, one single notorious event in Destiny's history was so controversial that it pushed a large chunk of the player base to the brink of quitting the game. Picture this scenario. For 3 years, you have grinded the best weapons in the game and fallen in love with some of Bungie's greatest creations. However, there's trouble in paradise. Your god-rolled kindled orchid? Gone. Reduced to atoms. Your beautiful, beautiful strikes and PvP maps? Gone. Lost in time like tears in the rain. Your precious raids? Your story that connects the timeline of Destiny? Your history that will be preserved in time? Gone. This sort of decision needed to be delicately and finely woven as to not interrupt and muddy, well, everything. First of all, let's define sunsetting as it relates to gaming. According to Simple Search, this is the initial phasing out of termination of something, and in business, the term is often used regarding brands, partnerships, agreements, policies, and hardware and software. Sunsetting was Bungie's decision to make the majority of weapons, armor, destinations, storylines, and endgame activities in Destiny 2 essentially unusable with the release of the expansion Beyond Light. Guns were changed so that they could not be infused beyond a power cap, which meant that they could no longer perform in high-tier content. This was twinned with the decision to remove a significant chunk of the game's content with the introduction of the DCV, the Destiny Content Vault. Think of sunsetting like a way to introduce fresh loot to chasten activities previously exhausted of the loot. Your god roll would need to be farmed again, and your armor the same way in the original vision. Think of the DCV like Disney's Vault of Movies, set to be released later down the road when the demand was high. This meant that stellar Red War campaign placed into the DCV, that raid stored in the DCV. Unlike Disney and entertainment through purely visual mediums, Destiny has different problems. Destiny is a live service first-person shooter with a connective tissue of a story and activity timeline. Locations and activities that had been present in Destiny 2 since release were removed from the game for seemingly unclear reasons. But before we get to the grave day, it is super important to understand some context as to why this decision was made, and historically, it's not like sunsetting didn't happen before. Sunsetting was not exclusively a Destiny 2 problem. Some people watching this video are Destiny 1 veterans and know exactly what I'm talking about when I mention 3 magical weapons: Fatebringer, Black Hammer, and Gjallarhorn. However, for the uninitiated, These 3 weapons form one of the most popular loadouts in Destiny 1. When people had acquired these 3 weapons, there simply would not be a need to gear up anything else. They were that good. If you ever needed to upgrade your gear, you wouldn't be interested in chasing anything new. This was evidently a problem for Bungie. Before the launch of the Taken King, they decided to both nerf Gjallarhorn as Destiny went into year 2, and also prevent players from using Gjallarhorn at max power, alluding to use rates and the gatekept nature of players always needing Gjallarhorn. Black Hammer was also significantly nerfed just before the Taken King, and other year 1 weapons had their power capped so that players would need to use year 2 weapons in higher level activities. This didn't just apply to the Soul loadout though, as Bungie made sure players couldn't use year 1 weapons going into year 2 of Destiny 1. This was seen as unpopular to some, and to others, this was seen as the necessary course, as most looter shooters do have some form of sunsetting. The important argument for those avidly against sunsetting in year 1 of Destiny 1 was the fact that Destiny was different. Its gunplay was so great, its weapons having stories like no game before made players attached to their loot. Sometimes you make something so good that people can't help but only want to use it. Most other games that have sunsetting put more value into the big number crunch, with weapons playing a placeholder role for more stats to collect. Think about how many games you have played that are similar to games like Diablo or World of Warcraft that have some form of seasonal sunsetting. Think about the weapons that you're using. Are you really attached to that one weapon? Maybe you are, but I don't think majority of players would agree or remember that staff that they're using. But Destiny had memories to be made with each. This would foreshadow one of many problems with sunsetting. Crucially, in the Taken King, Bungie ensured that they added just as many, if not more, rewards into year 2, and also ensured that these rewards were interesting and powerful, thus making players excited to chase them. They even sunset exotics back in year 1, something Destiny 2 never did, and there was less of a storm because the Taken King was that good. Now we need to fast forward to January of 2019, and Activision splits ways with Bungie over issues regarding profitability and sustainability of Destiny's big vision. Say what you want about Activision, but the publisher was an infinite cash machine for Bungie's vision, providing not only resources, but 2 additional studios in Vicarious Visions and High Moon Studios, both going away in the upcoming DLC Shadowkeep. That would prove difficult for Bungie. Now, Bungie did do some things to offset this, like make free-to-play in Shadowkeep very accessible, which shot the player base through the roof. Now we fast forward to 2020, and it was easy for players to see that Shadowkeep seasons were not going to live up to the excitement of Forsaken, and the call was real for a sequel of Destiny 2, since that was a part of Activision Bungie's original 10-year plan anyways, and it would give Bungie some time after going independent to get back on their feet and deliver something special. Well, Bungie had one other option than make an entire new game given the resources limits after you just lost Activision. And you have to pay over 1,000 people that had worked at Bungie at that time. On February 26th of 2020, the director's cut was released on Bungie.net. At the time, the game director was not Joe Blackburn. That role was the privilege of Luke Smith. Some of the decisions made by Luke Smith during his time as game director were truthfully ambitious, like year 1 of Red War with its systematic changes to fit a more esports and casual narrative. But this one was kind of insane. This article set in motion plans that were perhaps the most damaging the game had ever seen given proper hindsight. At the time, sunsetting wasn't this villainous idea it's made out to be. We know that in recent news, someone out there might have been calling the shots, and not even Luke Smith, but maybe faceless upper management. We just don't know. This is what Smith had to say in the article. Like many of you, I end up gravitating towards a few weapons and just use them instead of using everything else. Sure, Outlaw multi-kill clip Breachlight I just farmed from the Season of Dawn is nice, But is it really going to displace my go-to PvE kinetic weapons? Probably not, I know that. I recently sat with a couple of external folks who really love Breakneck. It's the only thing they use. They aren't going to use another primary weapon in Destiny 2. Why? Because they don't need to. In the world we're imagining, we'll have space at the top end to create powerful legendary weapons. Legendaries that are just better than other items in the classification. We'll be able to do that because the design space for weapons will expand and contract over time. Items will enter the ecosystem, be able to be infused for some number of seasons, and beyond that, their power won't be able to be raised. Legendary weapons will have fixed values for how high they can be infused. Those values will project the weapon's viable in endgame lifespan. And think of lifespan somewhere between 9 and 15 months. Reading this immediately sent alarm bells ringing through the vast majority of Destiny fans. Since the Forsaken expansion, which saw the return of random rolls, as well as special weapons in the kinetic and energy slot, there had been a vast array of legendary weapons to chase. Crucially, although everyone could agree there were some outliers such as pinnacle weapons, which were just too powerful to ignore, people had often found their own niche weapons which weren't necessarily popular, but just appealed to them. People couldn't understand why Bungie weren't just going to nerf the most powerful weapons, or even just apply this concept of sunsetting to the most broken weapons like Mountaintop and Recluse. Knowing that some of the weapons that you'd spent months or almost years grinding for were just going to become useless as soon as Beyond Light dropped was heartbreaking. But unlike the previous Destiny 1 example of giving more than taking with Year 2, Bungie was smaller than before now, and there wasn't that massive Year 2 DLC to supersede the year before. On top of that, a catastrophic real-world event was brewing just after sunsetting was announced.
The first coronavirus death in California. The patient, a passenger on a cruise from San Francisco. Tonight, that ship is being held off the California coast over concerns other people on board could be sick.
Now, on a more personal note here, I was a student at San Francisco State University at the time of that report, which basically sent the whole entire US into a shockwave. And I was studying for writing for TV when we shut down for what was supposed to be a week. But as we all know, that wasn't really the case. Reflecting on this time period from game to my personal life, my whole career of wanting to write for big shows turned into pursuing and placing that effort into YouTube. So thank you for letting me share my stories. It's an often forgotten element of how sunsetting in the DCV could have been muddied or improperly handled. The world was in chaos, and nobody knew how much of a shift COVID would have on us. Bungie couldn't work in an office, let alone work on the game for a long time. And Beyond Light was introducing so much change. How could this not blow up in their face? I was gonna save this for the conclusion, but I'll just say this now. Part of me wonders if this could have all been saved had Bungie just delayed their thinking a little bit longer. Who knows? On June 9th, 2020, the DCV, the Destiny Content Vault, was officially announced. For those of you who didn't play Destiny 2 at launch, there used to be a whole lot more content in the game. The original campaigns for each expansion, entire planets, and patrol spaces, raids, strikes, crucible maps, and more. However, with the launch of Beyond Light, a significant amount of content was moved into the DCV, a space for old content that Bungie argued was no longer integral or popular within the game. It must be said that before Beyond Light, the game was really, really big. Some would say too big. Bungie stated that the game was becoming too difficult to update and maintain effectively, and the best solution was to cut down some of the bloat in the game by removing content that the majority of players didn't really interact with. Of course, I'm no game developer, so I can't explain why this was the case, but the game was certainly performing pretty badly before Beyond Light. It took an insane amount of time to update the game. It was really time consuming to change gear and swap weapons between characters. Sometimes it would take forever to load into activities. There were all sorts of new bugs popping up, and yeah, it just wasn't good. However, while performance on console after the launch of Beyond Light was broadly alright, many players on PC suffered massive performance issues immediately after Beyond Light's launch that wouldn't be fully fixed. There's still some FPS issues, some lighting issues, and of course, We all know across every single console and PC, those servers. Now, I know it's not on the DCV for the servers, I just figured I wanted to shout that out. That being said, even if Bungie was removing 2/3 of the game's content for genuinely good reasons, it didn't feel good at all for the vast majority of the player base. Players had been asking Bungie to revamp old content for years, and the only real reason that players weren't actively playing things like the Menagerie seasonal activity or a raid was because it wasn't rewarding anymore, since they had effectively beaten it. This ties into a major issue that some players have with seasons in Destiny. Because seasonal content ultimately lasts for 1 year, the story and activities are removed when the new expansion launches. Does this mean that seasons are almost made to be sunset? To the point where, yeah, how much effort goes into a seasonal activity when you know it's going to be removed? I'm not saying that developers didn't work hard on it, of course they do, but activities kind of get made to be sunset and placed in the DCV. This brings with it a whole host of consequences, but one of the more immediate ones is that new and returning players have no clue about what's going on in the game at the start of a new expansion. The introduction of the DCV took this issue and made it significantly worse. New and returning players can't even play the original campaign that kicked off Destiny 2 in the first place. You might think, well, Evan, there would be no reason to. We already know the story finished, and it takes up so much space when the numbers really aren't there. Just because the story is done for you doesn't mean that its absence isn't immeasurable. Without the story, you ask, who is Cade? Who is Gaul? Why are there all the enemies? What is the Traveler? Why do I care to get invested? The same goes for virtually everything on that end, but especially campaigns and raids. Imagine a free-to-play player who was given the best experience in Shadowkeep, free year 1 with Red War, Curse of Osiris, and Warmind with the respective quests, exotics, campaigns, PvPs, raids, you get the point. Now, all gone, and replaced by the Cosmodrome's return in a shallow state, and more questions leading to more confusion. There wasn't even a catch-up video for players, not a timeline either. It was sloppy. And no amount of Aztecross showing up in the Cosmodrome was going to fix that. The amount of content that was cut is beyond staggering. Here is a non-exhaustive list, because if I went through literally everything, we'd be here forever. 4 campaigns, 9 strikes, 5 raids, 7 Crucible maps, 6 destinations. This list is already staggering, but it's still only a small selection of just how much is still missing from Destiny 2 at the minute. For example, exotic quests were all removed if the location was sunset, instead placed in a kiosk, removing all the great adventure and reason to get attached to them. It was so sloppy that even lore justifications made no sense. Why were some maps from locations removed while others from the same location stayed? Of course, Bungie has cycled some content back into the game, but it's not always received well, as fans note that locations with a fresh coat of paint share too much identity to the assets removed previously, and bosses like the infamous Valkaor are reduced to a taken version in an easy seasonal mission. It just makes you wonder why that saving space argument came to be. In my video on Destiny 2 Desperately Needs to Change, I said that Bungie wasn't making the game for anyone at the release of Beyond Light. It was so sloppy to the point that weapons were originally on a seasonal timer to expire every few seasons from the season you acquired the drop, with no updates to the perk pools, meaning that when you beat Last Wish in the Season of the Hunt, you would have to grind the Nation of Beasts again for that same role again. You can see this was meant to be the original vision, as each old weapon still in the game before Bungie corrected course is marked with the Season of Arrival's logo. One of 2 seasons left before the cutoff. It's plain to see that even to this day, sunsetting in the DCV have left a bad taste in the player base's mouth. While most understand that the game couldn't keep getting bigger forever, and most understand that not all of the content removed was absolutely phenomenal, it really sucks to have content that you paid for removed, especially when you have absolutely no idea when it might get added back to the game. It doesn't help that some of the content that we have received since Beyond Light was considered to be shallow and lacking in depth and replay value. The introduction of the DCV absolutely compounded the problem of sunsetting, and as a result, Even though Season of Arrivals was great, many players were less concerned about the looming pyramid ships on the horizon than they were about the prospect of losing some of their most valuable guns and favorite activities. As Beyond Light launched, the marketing campaign did its job well. A lot of people, self included, were excited for this next chapter of Destiny. But as day one approached and we saw the results of sunsetting, the player base's hearts collectively dropped. So, to recap, sunsetting was introduced alongside the DCV just before the release of Beyond Light, and many players were extremely upset. As Beyond Light launched with Season of the Hunt, those who'd expected things to be bad were proven correct. While there were certainly aspects of Beyond Light that were good, such as the new raid Deepstone Crypt, Destiny fans were frustrated that the loot pool had become unbelievably small, and that the game felt much smaller and shallower than it had before. The returning Cosmodrome location did not feel very fleshed out, especially because it was missing the Plague Lands, one of Destiny 1's most interesting areas, as well as missing the DLC areas from Taken King too. Iconic locations such as Titan, Mars, and Mercury were just gone, and the remaining loot left to chase was either boring or rapidly approaching expiry. Perhaps one of the biggest slaps in the face was the first mission of Beyond Light, which rewarded players with a soon-to-be sunset Long Shadow sniper rifle, essentially a useless weapon that had been in the game for a while, and it was marked with a Season of Arrivals logo. And it's not like this was something new from the Beyond Light campaign. This was a weapon already in the game. The Long Shadow was just a sniper to some, but it was a symbol of Bungie stubbornly implementing a system despite a negative reaction from a lot of players in the community. Of course, most people could understand the need for sunsetting, as power creep had been a legitimate problem for a while before Beyond Light. However, the way in which it was implemented left a sour taste in players' mouths that didn't fade for many seasons to come. People definitely chased weapons, but each new season brought the pain of losing some of the coolest weapons that Bungie had ever dropped. In the 2021 State of the Game that released on February 5th of 2021, a few weeks after the release of Season of the Chosen, and conveniently on the time that Outriders was stealing some player base, Bungie released an absolute bombshell with new game director Joe Blackburn in charge. Sunsetting was going to be reversed to an extent. While old weapons wouldn't become usable again in new content, weapons and armor that were about to be sunset would no longer have an infusion cap, essentially meaning that they could be used forever. Here is an excerpt from the State of the Game post which explains exactly why Bungie decided to reverse sunsetting. While we still believe in these goals, it's clear our execution was off the mark. Infusion caps helped us meaningfully in the shift of meta in Beyond Light and created reward ecosystems that were manageable to balance and monitor, but the system has also made our rewards feel like they have an expiration date and have frequently made playing our legacy content feel shallow. We want the rewards you've earned in Beyond Light and subsequent seasons to feel like valuable tools you can use in an incredible challenge you'll face in the Witch Queen, so we're making a change. While we strongly believe that Destiny needs a method to shift our meta in the game's most challenging activities, we don't believe that infusion caps are the right answer. We're taking time this year to research and validate a plan that creates a fresh and balanceable ecosystem for our most aspirational content, one that doesn't make our rewards feel like they have an expiration date. If it wasn't obvious already, the announcement that Bungie was going to sunset sunsetting made practically every single member of the community ecstatic beyond belief. Yes, it stung that old weapons weren't going to be able to be brought back, but for the most part, people couldn't believe what they were hearing. Bungie had reverted their biggest mistake ever, and the future of Destiny 2 looked much, much brighter. Or was it? The thing that is important to look at for our story is that this decision came after a lot of change that went into these massive changes, and Bungie acted reactionary to the community rather than explaining their vision further. To me, the lack of communication was a big moment in the story, and radio silence wasn't going to work on Bungie's end. and it caused Bungie to get reactionary to what the community wanted immediately, without seeing a potential future vision through. Sunsetting still has an impact on the game. Players can't use the weapons they originally lost unless you hoarded and didn't listen to Dado's vault cleansing. You are still screwed in these weapons for now. There's a huge amount of content that hasn't made a comeback into Destiny 2 either. Or at least it made a very partial, non-satisfying comeback into Destiny 2. Thinking of you, Titan, or thinking of the Leviathan patrol space. However, the more interesting idea is that sunsetting still has an effect on Destiny 2 to this day because it affects certain aspects of the game that were introduced. For starters, let's go back to Joe Blackburn's article about balancing the ecosystem of aspirational content. What did he necessarily mean by that? In my opinion, let's consider this idea with weapon crafting, which was released with the Witch Queen. The idea that weapon crafting was affected by the introduction of sunsetting is interesting. If sunsetting were still a thing, being able to get god rolls with minimal effort through crafting wouldn't even be a big issue, because these weapons would be phased out within a year. Now we have issues with weapons that are objectively the best in slots, and rarely get replaced, even without crafting. We have seen a shift over the years to be more ability focused in Destiny 2, no doubt. But we still have seen a return to the issue that Pinnacle weapons had all over again because of massive power creep with certain weapons that are crafted and enhanced, and intrinsic perks. Looking at you, Forbearance. Paul Tassi summed this up well in his article that was released at the beginning of October, specifying that we have seen very real effects on power creep. The whole point of sunsetting in the first place was to try to stave off power creep by making better and better weapons that came before. But now that's exactly what happened. Subclass integrated legendaries, for instance, have become almost essential at this point for those slots. New heavy DPS options have to outclass old heavy DPS options to stay relevant. On the PvP side, sunsetting didn't even really do all that much, as the mode is mostly about meta balancing no matter what guns are in the pool. He also mentioned a very real issue that has come with weapon crafting. Quote, "Can I put out an unpopular opinion within an unpopular opinion? I think sunsetting would be a place to either eliminate or dramatically reduce crafting in the game, as I firmly believe it has hurt the loot chase. While I recognize the endless lottery farming for god rolls isn't good, there are many other ways that kind of RNG could be reduced without the ability to craft god rolls of 70% of the weapons in the game at any given time. A sunsetting reset could be the time to heavily adjust that." Paul Tassi is right here. The crafting debate is not one that has a clear-cut answer, and a lot of people didn't enjoy spending hundreds of hours to grind for a god roll that could compete with others in an ever-changing meta. Weapon crafting has essentially created new pinnacles that are just as strong, if not stronger, than pinnacles that were used before sunsetting took place. This discussion raises an interesting and yet disturbing question. Would crafting have been better rolled out with sunsetting still active? Was crafting in development to pair with sunsetting? Obviously now the attunement process is some middle ground, but this is a question I often ask myself and my community for a reason. Crafting is causing problems in the sense that people are not as incentivized to chase rolls now that something has to be really good in order to compete with a crafted weapon. And even then, they'll get deleted immediately afterwards, even if they're a good roll, just because of that nice red border to fill out a slot to then craft exactly what you want. It sounds eerily similar to the issues that existed before sunsetting, but we're stuck at an impasse here because sunsetting was so poorly received that if it were implemented again, it would undoubtedly be a nightmare scenario for the vast majority of the player base. Sunsetting is the word that makes people clench their fist and pop their eyes open for a reason. Picture it. Reddit Destiny the game would go thermonuclear. Destiny 2 fans would be crying their eyes out and peeing their pants. Paul Tassi would be put into a rocket and launched at the sun. Me? I'd be hit with more editor comments than you know what to do with. The debate also doesn't deal with the very real fact that the DCV still exists and is preventing some of the best Destiny 2 content ever made from being experienced by all the players in the game. I think it's pretty uncontroversial to say that it would be a blessing to be able to play the old campaigns, quests, PvP maps, and raids again. If we can have 2 more raids, making 7, since those 5 were lost, and more years of campaign than had been sunset with the final shape to come, and the return of secret missions, why was it a problem then and not a problem now? Maybe it is a problem now, and I'm just missing something huge here. Well, I was missing the final piece of information. See, last year after the Bungie layoffs, I was on a community summit podcast hosted by my friend above. And in this podcast, my other friend Glad said something very interesting.
I'm pretty sure that's like the biggest fucking issue. Because at the summit, I heard from Bungie's mouth, they specifically mentioned PlayStation storage not being able to hold all the content that they had for Destiny 2.
Wow.
And I'm not under NDA in this anymore because it's happened.
So it was an old console issue then. The DCV, sunsetting, all of this was because of old console storage. I'm not going to shame people for using older hardware, but if what Glad said is 100% true and not being misquoted, then this is a Bungie issue not doing what they had previously done with Rise of Iron, and outgrowing the old consoles due to limitations of the hardware. We are still making Destiny 2 able to be played on PlayStation 4 and Xbox One. Think about that. I started the Destiny 1 beta on these consoles. That's either a technical marvel by Bungie to still be doing this on these consoles, or a failure depending on who you ask. Bear in mind, once again, that I am not a game dev, and the majority of people watching the video aren't game developers either. Hell, most people don't even know that most game developers are contracted to fulfill a role and they do not get to make the choices in the game. Most game developers are extremely pro player. We just have no idea how difficult or how easy this job really is. But I think it's safe to say that it's about as simple as getting a drunk cow to break into Fort Knox. That being said, you can respect Bungie's people and hate the decisions that the company made. I also hate to say this. Although sunsetting in the DCV may have been the worst decision as a Destiny fan, as a business, there is some arguments to be made that sunsetting actually helped Bungie a ton. So, to recap, sunsetting was a deeply unpopular strategy that Bungie implemented because, in their words, they wanted to combat power creep and make it easier to update and maintain the game. It saw a majority of weapons that players have been using since Destiny 2 start becoming virtually useless overnight, because players could no longer take them into the highest tiers of content like Grandmaster Nightfalls, Raids, Trials of Osiris, etc. At the same time, Bungie removed vast swaths of the game's content, sending them into the Shadow Realm, the DCV, the Destiny Content Vault. While some of this content would eventually return in some way or another, often as a shallow, depressing shell of what they used to be, the majority of it has been lost to the void for years now. It is more than likely true that most of this content would virtually be impossible to put everything in the game at the same time right now. But it doesn't change the fact that people paid a lot of money for content that they can no longer access in a game anymore. Some suggestions I've seen around the internet are pretty great for what Bungie could do or could have done in hindsight. And of course, hindsight's always going to be our friend, so I'll give them some slack there. From some suggestions, it was simply to make a sequel. Of course, that would take a lot of years, and maybe Bungie wasn't prepared to make a sequel at that point. Others suggested having a legacy collection that you could keep downloaded as a separate file, and if the activity required that to be downloaded, you could just go in and select that download. But if it was a space issue, you could remove it from your end. The bottom line is that Bungie didn't realize, or maybe they did realize, how attached everyone was to their loot and the activities. I want to take a break from everything that we've talked about so far, and I want you to think about this scenario. And please don't take this cynical thought as a deep version of me thinking on this part for years as I'm making this video. I've sat here thinking about sunsetting for a long time. This video on the complicated history of sunsetting has been in my mind since 2021, but Bungie's seasonal model was made a lot easier to fit the studio's size after sunsetting and after the DCV. Sony acquired Bungie for billions, and the model didn't evolve the way players wanted. In fact, we got less each year for more pay in the seasons, and it became a trip to the holo projector each week for some loot. That was a lesser or sometimes better version than old. But the drip feeding of content, which is basically these small bites each week of loot and story, might have been what made the Sony purchase happen to begin with. The DCV was innovative whether we like it or not for live service, and Bungie proved to the space that live service could exist on weekly small bites, so players had just enough reason to jump on for a taste and keep them on that hook. The DCV and sunsetting to bring those weapons back slower over time supplemented that in the best way possible. Anyways, that's just a silly little thought. On the other side of things, I'm happy to say that sunsetting has now been kinda removed. There isn't a power cap on any weapon or armor piece, so everything can be infused up? Cool? What about all those god rolls that are still gone because they weren't allowed to be infused up before? Bungie looks to be unleashing the whole vault with the final shape, and that is really exciting and, in my opinion, something that I will be personally celebrating. But it does still come with such a blunder of wonder and a sting of knowing that, well, we got used as an experiment for a step in Bungie's live service. That's not to say that nothing was good between the DCV, sunsetting, and now, but it doesn't change the facts. Anyways, this is a video I've been wanting to make for a while, and if you enjoyed it, make sure you subscribe. Join my Patreon as I'm updating it very soon. I know I keep saying that, but I really do mean that. Final shape videos are just getting insane, and I have one massive project coming very soon that I can't wait to show you guys. And make sure you guys tune in for the Pantheon event. Much love, everyone, and I'll see you on my socials, Discord, whatever else. And, yep, I'll see you in the video. Goodbye.